Right. Well, hello everyone. I'm Derek Johnston. I'm a lecturer in broadcast and media at Queen's University in Belfast. I mostly work in analysing television, though I've also researched film, literature and radio, and my most recent article is partly about comics. My main areas of interest are with the ways that media work in relation to culture as means of engaging with our concerns, our hopes, and our identities. So it's maybe no surprise that I'm interested in the representation of history through the media, and also that I am interested in the Gothic. In this session, I want to bring the two together and think about what happens when we do this. What happens when we present historical drama in a Gothic mode? I hope you find the ideas that I present interesting, and you'll have ideas for discussion in the breaks we'll be taking at the end of each section. I will say this is a research project that's fairly early on. So certainly in the last session, I've now got two, at least, major research areas that I've now got to fill in as I continue on this. So ideas and questions and comments are very, very welcome. Anyway, here's the outline of the session as planned, which will begin with some definitions and some core concepts and ideas of why the Gothic might be particularly relevant now. I'll then take us through a couple of case studies and use those to try and put the ideas into focus, show where some of them come from and how they might interact. A chance for any other questions or discussion that comes from that. And then a very, very brief kind of summary section before we have any final discussion. Obviously, if there's no questions in the Q&A sections, we move on quickly. So, first of all, definitions. What do I mean by Gothic historical television dramas? This group brings together what we might think of as a genre and a mode. The historical drama is the genre, a fiction set sometime in the past. Historical dramas can take on, and do, take on aspects of a range of other genres, or we can consider them as taking on a range of different modes. Swashbucklers emphasize action and the role of the individual. Romances emphasize the tension between love and duty and often ideas of class as well as gender. Comedies often emphasize the contrasts between past and present. And of course, each program can contain elements of a range of genres and modes. A swashbuckler will typically include a romantic element as well as some aspects of comedy and may incorporate political drama, for example. The mode that we're concerned with here is the Gothic. I'm building here on Helen Wheatley's classic work on Gothic television, where she defines the television Gothic largely in relation to the themes that come from the literary Gothic, while also emphasizing elements of style and presentation that may draw on the Gothic in pictorial art or film, but which can also be specific to the television medium, such as the domestic reception. I particularly want to emphasize Wheatley's concept of the feel-bad heritage production. This takes Andrew Higson's idea of the heritage film, which analysed a set of historical films from the 1980s, particularly Merchant Ivory productions, and argued that their gorgeous production and presentation of an attractive upper or upper middle class life detracted from the social and cultural commentary of the narratives, so that what audiences were more likely to remember were the attractive visuals, rather than the people pushing back against the mores and restrictions of society at the time. Higson considered this to be part of the marketization of heritage, presenting the primarily English past as a commodity that could be sold to both international and domestic audiences. Wheatley's feel-bad heritage, on the other hand, emphasizes the social and cultural commentary through the same attention to detail in presenting the past. Only here, that detail shows wear, damage, dirt, corruption, complexity. Instead of grace and elegance as shown in heritage productions, feel-bad heritage productions emphasize restriction, the weight of history and society, confinement, and wear. Overall, then, when I talk about Gothic historical dramas, I mean dramas which have a focus on the ways that historical trauma informs and acts in the present of the drama in a historical setting, through an emphasis on violence, corruption, and power. The trauma typically can be clearly seen to have relevance to the modern audience. The drama should incorporate secrets, concealment, and transgression, key elements of the Gothic. I also mean an adoption of what could be considered a Gothic aesthetic, dark, dirty, desaturated colours, apart from occasional rich reds, but also an emphasis on detail and style, particularly with a sense of layering and elaboration. The aesthetic may well extend to the music and a disruption or merging of styles from different periods. There will be clear use of symbolic imagery, whether visual or in language or both, adding to a sense of there being deeper meaning and probably connecting to the supernatural, mystical, and religious, although the presence of the actual supernatural is not necessary. Humans are more than capable enough of producing horror without the intervention of the supernatural, and the Gothic itself does not depend on the supernatural, although it does, of course, make for a useful way of tackling social, cultural, and other mundane horrors through metaphor. Now, there is a long history of what might be termed Gothic historical dramas. I could point them to you going back to the 1940s at least, if not some in the 30s. And here are some recent examples, some that I am considering. The whole history of these Gothic historicals includes, of course, adaptations of Gothic texts. It also includes a number of Victorian set productions, unsurprising considering the development of the neo-Gothic aesthetic during the Victorian period and the importance of Victorian Gothic fictions to Gothic literature. But to be a Gothic historical drama is not just about the aesthetic. It must also include engagement with those themes of trauma and horror, of secrets and transgression. I do want to emphasize here that I am not claiming that all historical dramas are Gothic historical dramas. There are plenty of examples of other modes. However, I do think that there has been an increased turn to the Gothicization of historical drama over the past 10 to 20 years. That may be more to do with the idea being reinforced by my own tastes, so that I am seeing more of these whilst the actual proportion is no different than in the past. However, I do think that there are reasons that the Gothic historical drama is particularly suited to the present moment. And I think that we can see elements, at least, of the Gothic appearing in adaptations of, say, Agatha Christie novels, where those elements were not present in previous adaptations. This again suggests that the Gothic mode has a particular relevance and usefulness here. So I want to fairly briefly outline at least some of the reasons that I think the Gothic mode is relevant now. Then we can have a break for questions and answers and a chance to discuss these general ideas before moving on to look at the case studies. So, one reason for the use of the Gothic mode is that the Gothic aesthetic is appealing and suits the potential for depth and detail made possible and appreciable by modern televisions and television making. The aesthetic usefully can also suit the increased viewing of television on smaller screens such as mobile phones, as it can direct the attention more to faces picked out in light, surrounded by darkness, although they can also be accused of murky imagery. As Gothic television dramas regularly make use of the potential of modern camera and screen technology to include subtle background elements to enhance the mood and emphasize themes, these may not be visible on smaller screens, again, possibly urging reviewing on a larger screen. because this aspect of the Gothic aesthetic, its use of detail, can be understood as useful in the attempts to draw people to pay attention to the screen. Like the Easter eggs of a franchise production, it encourages attention to detail from the viewer, and so a closer attention to the screen rather than using the drama as a background to whatever else you might be doing. It could also be taken as encouraging discussion of the drama due to paying close attention and so promoting it more widely by word of mouth. Whilst not a strictly historical drama, I would suggest something like Mike Flanagan's Haunting of Hill House, and the fact that there's ghosts in the background of every shot of the house, and the idea of discussing with other people, whether in person or online, about, did you see that one? Have you spotted that one? And it repaying, rewatching. The increased availability of streaming services, whether subscriber or for terrestrial broadcasters, as well as of DVRs, means that it is easier to binge watch episodes and also to rewatch, rewarding the rewatching by presenting more detail. In this, the Gothic historical drama fits with what Marijke Jenner has described as the extension of the quality drama aesthetic to become a standard for streaming services, with complexity and rewatchability being key characteristics of quality television drama. Indeed, streaming has shown a tendency towards more complex narratives that may encourage rewatching to understand how the various strands of plot fit together, and which make little use of access for ease of access for those who've not necessarily been following in close detail. While not essential to the Gothic, complex and intertwining plots are a common element of Gothic narrative. So again, this suggests why a Gothic mode may be considered more relevant to current television. There's also the aspect of making these dramas stand out from other historical dramas. Television commissioners are often to be found claiming that their next round of commissions will break away from the cliche of cozy period dramas, while often also saying in other press releases that the new season will incorporate old favourites and some new historical dramas which provide that sense of comfort and nostalgia. In television, you have to try to please all of the people all of the time, just not necessarily with all of the product. However, different aesthetics do signal different approaches and tones and different periods even. So the mid-20th century on television is teal and orange. Look at Call the Midwife and the Ipcress file for how this aesthetic appears in two productions with different tones, different modes, and different themes that just happen to be set in roughly the same time period. Programs that are considered cozy may deal with social and cultural issues and trauma. Again, Call the Midwife is centrally concerned with changes to community, but also with health, and particularly with the role of women in society and with women's health. There is a lot of physical, social, and mental trauma in Call the Midwife. This is the show that had a man's necrotic foot come off in a nurse's hand. And much of it is still relevant today. But it's not a Gothic historical drama because it is focused on the solutions and on the positive power of care and community rather than on the negative and traumatic. And because it does not, despite the Victorian Gothic of Nonnatus House, typically make use of a Gothic aesthetic. Another aspect of appealing to a range of different audiences through a range of different approaches to historical drama is thinking about gender and conceptions of gendered narrative. Now, these are cliches, stereotypes, gender essentialist and simplistic, and based on rather old-fashioned ideas about what appeals to what gender in historical fiction. But it is possible that these Gothic historical dramas, at least many of them, are in part considered as a masculinized response to the cliched idea of feminine costume drama. I would say particularly here, the ones from Stephen Knight, considering their emphasis on mental and physical trauma and violence. There's plenty to interrogate in those assumptions, cliches and ideas, and I suspect that gender is going to be one of the areas where I need to do a lot more research for the development of the project. But as a headline, as a way in, it serves as an easy way to show how producers and broadcasters are trying to serve a wider audience and move away from the often denigrated, cozy heritage drama. I think audience research does actually show that more women than men watch historical dramas. More men will watch the military action adventure ones, your Sharps and your Hornblowers, and presumably SAS Rogue Heroes. But more men will watch historical documentary, again, depending on subject. So it is cliche, it is stereotype, it is essentialist, but there are also there's actually some research behind it. Anyway, there's also a reason why the Gothic might be particularly relevant today in treating historical subjects. And that's simply due to our increased awareness of the ways that historical trauma is still relevant and does still have an impact on modern lives and cultures. Obvious examples would be the legacies of empire and slavery, but equally striking and relevant would be the legacies of capitalist exploitation on environment and class. This can lead us to consider the way that the past in all of its representations is politicized, how certain behaviors and periods are valorized by some and condemned by others. And that's why it's important to consider the way that our historical television dramas are framed and presented, and which modes they take. And again, we could say, well, which modes do we get for which periods? So that's my basic framework of what the Gothic historical television drama is, or at least my thinking at the moment, and why I think it's important to consider. We have the opportunity now for some brief discussion before I move on to tackle some case studies. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask or put them in the chat. But I would also like your suggestions of what programs you would consider as Gothic historical television dramas, partly to give me some more examples, but also to see how we can start mapping the field and maybe considering some of the tensions and differences at work there. Right, so in this section, I want to take a look at a couple of examples of these dramas in order to examine and try out some of the ideas that I am playing with here. I will start with Taboo, written by Stephen Knight, based on a story by Tom Hardy and his father Chips, and starring Tom Hardy. Taboo is extreme, and extreme in its engagement with the ideas here, and particularly in the way that it seeks to invert and challenge expected elements of the period drama. I will then move on to the series which actually gave me the initial idea or impetus for this research, the television adaptation of Joan Lindsay's Picnic at Hanging Rock. But first, Taboo. Taboo is the story of James Keziah Delaney, played by Tom Hardy there, who returns to Regency England from his presumed death off the coast of Africa, where it is revealed he was part of an East India Company crew that were conducting an illegal slaving voyage under another flag. When the ship hit a storm and was expected to go down, Delaney was ordered to nail shut the hatches so that the slaves below would be guaranteed to go down with the ship, ensuring that none could survive and so possibly reveal the illegal venture. He did so willingly, but is himself presumed dead with the loss of the ship. Instead, he is washed ashore, taken in by African tribespeople, and eventually sets out for England, killing an African slaver on the way to take his diamonds. These diamonds are to fund Delaney's revenge against the East India Company, and essentially, in many ways, buying off his guilt. He seeks to enact this revenge by returning his father's trading company to good fortune. In many ways, we can see Taboo as a clear and intentional inversion of many expectations of a period drama. Many of the tropes of period dramas are there and present, but then they're subverted, their dark side revealed, and so the whole ideology of these dramas is challenged. Perhaps the clearest example of this is that Taboo includes a ball scene, that staple of the period drama, the costume drama. However, Delaney refuses to dance, insisting he is unable to and does not get dragged in to the dance. Rather than the ball offering a chance for romance, it's an opportunity to meet a spy who has valuable information. While the ball starts in the way that we might expect, presenting a set of carefully choreographed dance figures, which show the carefully choreographed social interactions and organization of the society depicted, the ball soon becomes a riot of mingling bodies packed closely. By this point, there's no focus on the dances and who is pairing with who in potential romantic interest. Instead, there are various sideshows to retain the guests' interests. The guests, as you may guess from this image, are largely drunk and further intoxicated by the nitrous oxide being touted around the ball. The romantic connection and associated jealousy that we would expect to find at a ball in a costume drama is here, and has the common result of a challenge to a duel. But the connection that Delaney reinforces at the ball, apart from with the American spies, is with his half-sister, and it is an erotic rather than romantic connection. BBC One primetime. So from that one example, we can see how Taboo picks up on various common tropes and subverts them, breaching various taboos and engaging in various transgressions along the way. We have the traveler returned from a distant land, but he is now tattooed and brutal, engaging in iwi rituals that distance him from society and that the wealth that he brings from that distant land is from slave diamonds gained through murder. This, of course, can be compared to the trope of the person who has made their fortune through their trade or estates overseas in other Regency dramas, where it is often easy to overlook that that trade is the trade of colonized people's resources, or indeed of other people, and that those estates are likely to be profitable because of their use of slaves and indentured labor. And of course, those estates overseas are only where they are because of imperialist capitalism, the overthrow and suppression of local power and the extraction of value to move it elsewhere, such as England. In Taboo, we do have the duel over a woman's honor, or rather over a man's pride and honor, which is in his ownership of a woman. Only the duel is rigged in this case by the agents of the American government, whose political and commercial interests are best served by keeping Delaney alive. And our protagonist is entirely guilty of what he is accused of, has no real honor to protect because he doesn't really care for honor. So the whole edifice and pageantry of the duel and its supposed stance in relation to ideas of honor and rightness is broken down, and instead the outcome is determined not by moral wealth, worth, valor, or even skill, but rather by the exercise of commercial interests on a grey and muddied island. As I said last time, there must be a metaphor in there somewhere. This is at the core of Taboo, and also something that can be found in other Gothic historical dramas, such as Peaky Blinders, also written by Stephen Knight. Commerce, money, and capitalism drive everything. Indeed, in Taboo, even the Prince Regent, Mark Gatiss, made up to look like an elderly Stuart Granger, is shown to be afraid of the East India Company and their economic power, even if he does have his own highly efficient network of spies, which seems more effective even than the incredibly effective network run by the company. All activity, legal or illegal, is driven by money and commerce. Political interests require money and trade to achieve their goals, but that need means that commerce overtakes the philosophical and ideological drives within the politics, such as that of the burgeoning United States, which features strongly in the drama. Because the central concern within Taboo is ownership of Nootka Sound. This real place is a part of what is now Canada, and in the drama is presented as being owned by Delaney's father, acquired in a trade with the native First Nations people, in which he also acquired a wife, Delaney's mother, who we see pictured there. Ownership of the Sound will provide important trading access not only to the United States and the British territory of Canada, but also onwards to trading opportunities in the Pacific, such as the trade with China, that all-important tea trade. Because of this, Aris Moussoutsanis considers Taboo as an example of imperial Gothic for the days of global Britain, Empire 2.0, and Brexit, as it represents the power and grandeur of the empire in the reach of both Crown and Company. While these aspects of success could be admired or at least appreciated aesthetically, those imperial forces and motivations are also the agent of horror, monstrosity, and villainy. Taboo is thus part of a wider revisiting of imperial and colonial narratives such as Banished, Indian Summers, Beecham House, and storylines in Poldark and Sanditon. These narratives may present a more nuanced appreciation of the exploitative nature of imperialism and its power imbalances, or acknowledge imperial guilt, but often do so in ways which maintain the appealing image of colonial life and imperial power. In Taboo, though, Delaney brings the traumas of the colonized, the enslaved, and the exploited back to London. As noted before, his mother was a First Nations American who was bought by his father, Delaney believes, for a handful of beads, making Delaney himself a result of imperialist capitalism. This is then enhanced by his education as a cadet in the East India Company, where he is noted to be skilled at everything that the company required: musket, shipcraft, leadership, until he starts to show a rebellious and violent streak, with violence being directed not against his fellow cadets or unfortunates from other countries, but against officers and authority. And it is the company that secretly and unofficially sends him to Africa to take part in a slaving mission, which results in his guilt and his desire for revenge, and his attaining the capital for his mission. His tattoos mark him out as other, as does his use of rituals presumably learned in Africa, and his use of the Iwi language, again presumably learned in Africa. So Delaney is both colonizer and colonized, a once slaver who now aids an anti-slavery campaigner. In this tension, we can see a continuation of Andrew Higson's original conception of the heritage drama, which acknowledged that these films often contain narrative elements which critiqued the society shown, but where such critique was undercut by the way that the society was presented so appealingly. While it is questionable how appealing Taboo's depiction of British society is, it is notable that, as Moussoutsanis points out, the series replicates colonialist horror narratives of Africa and North America as sources of primitive magic. I would argue that Delaney is shown to gain power, whether it is psychological or actually supernatural, from his experiences of going native, but that this power includes with it a lot of brutality and violence, which builds on the physical and economic brutality and violence taught to him as a cadet of the East India Company. I think that we are supposed to recognize that Delaney is bringing the violence of the company home, making physical and real for the officers of the company and their allies the brutality of their policies and economic activity abroad that is the result of boardroom discussions in London. However, Delaney's violence is accompanied by iconography of the colonized rather than the colonist, by his tattoos, his weapons, his cutting out of hearts and consuming parts of the body. This may make literal and immediate the violence of the company and its policies, but this violence still seems to come from elsewhere. Indeed, heritage aside, Delaney is repeatedly referred to as other than human, with human in this case, of course, meaning white, Anglican, English, male, with a sense of a superiority that brings. Not only that, but Delaney is also not setting out to bring down the underlying structures of imperialism and capitalism, but instead to bring down, or at least damage, one expression of these in order to establish his own commercial concern and his own political and economic power, only centered in the Americas. He is replacing the old world with the new. And while future seasons of the series may go on to challenge the myths of the North American colonialist and commercial project that it currently seems to be accepting, at the end of season 1, it appears that Taboo accepts ideas that a ragged band of misfits can find their fortunes and future in the opportunities of America. At least they can if they are funded by diamonds stolen from an African slave trader, and particularly if they are led by someone who has an ancestral as well as a legal connection to the place. So Taboo presents a version of the historical drama that emphasizes the traumas of imperialist capitalism. It addresses the typically unasked question of many a Regency romance. Where does the hero get his money from? And the answer is not a pleasant one. It takes familiar elements from historical narratives, the ball, the need to prove inheritance, the long-lost relative, and it draws out the dark potential in them. And yet, in the end, the systems remain, and the only escape is to a different expression of those systems. One Gothic historical drama that does offer a potential for escape, at least for certain people, is the program that actually started me on this line of research, Picnic at Hanging Rock. This 2018 adaptation of Joan Lindsay's 1967 novel explores the story around the disappearance of 3 schoolgirls and a teacher while on a St. Valentine's Day picnic at Hanging Rock in the Australian bush in 1900. As a television series, this adaptation took the opportunity of the extended runtime to develop characters and backstory in ways that the 1975 Peter Weir film version, one of my favorite films of all time, did not do. In fact, many of the complaints about the series were that it was too much concerned with giving backstory and explaining things. And whilst the novel and the film both suggest that there are reasons for the women to want to disappear, the series makes the social and cultural pressures on the women central concerns through that development of backstory. This emphasis on these negative pressures, constraints, and traumas is accompanied by an aesthetic which frequently emphasizes darkness and shadows and incorporates more Gothic imagery than Weir's film. While Weir made use of the contrast between the bright outside of the bush and the dark and constraining interiors of the college, he largely avoided imagery that we might associate with traditional Gothic, particularly Victorian Gothic. Although considering the Victorian style of the college and the costumes of the characters, some elements are still present. I will note that Natalie Dormer referred to those little sunglasses that she's wearing there as her Oldman glasses, because they're like the ones that Gary Oldman wore in Bram Stoker's Dracula when Dracula's about the town in his lovely grey suit. Miniseries also makes use of clearly modern rather than period music and avoids the dreamy mysticism of Weir's use of George Zamphia's panpipes. It employs more disruptive camera work and editing with canted angles, occasional harsh cuts, and jumps back and forth in time to provide the Gothic disruption of time, which I mentioned in the first section. This serves to both disorientate and also to show connections and provide explanations in a way that are more straightforwardly linear presentation would not. This is supplemented further by the presentation of dreams and memories, blurring the boundaries of past, present, and future, real and imagined. So this adaptation fits my criteria for the Gothic historical drama because of its use of Gothic aesthetics and also because it is centrally concerned with trauma. As with Taboo, there are multiple traumas represented in Picnic at Hanging Rock, particularly classism and sexism. These are also present in the novel and the Weir film, but are emphasized in the television series. Added to classism and sexism are clearer elements of racism, prejudice against homosexuality, and anti-Semitism. It certainly seems that everyone at Appleyard's College is there to escape something, or because they are considered not to fit into the dominant social and cultural structures. Appleyard herself is reinvented from being a respectable widow to being an ex-thief who is escaping her criminal past in England and recreating herself in the remoteness of Australia as a respectable widow, raising herself in class as well as economic status. Miranda is still beautiful and free-spirited, but this is more clearly marked as rebellion against expectations of what a woman should be, emphasizing her past growing up on a farm, her superiority to her brothers at farm work, and her independence. Marion in the series is mixed race. Irma may be wealthy and beautiful, but she is marked out by being of Jewish descent. Miss McCraw is a lesbian. There is a clear attraction between Miranda and Marion. Outside of the college, Michael Fitzhubert has been sent to Australia from England for displaying his attraction to another man while at Cambridge, during what appears to be a game or ritual based on imperialist ideas of primitive rituals, with the students parading around a fire in their shorts, socks, and shoes, with boot black or mud smeared on their faces. Mike's attraction to the stable boy, Albert, is also made clear, and even setting that aside, the two form a strong, cross-class connection. There are many examples of texts which work with the tensions between urban, civilized Australia and the outback as something wild, other, and unknowable. Of course, this is in part a clash between European and Aboriginal cultures and their attitudes and relationships towards land and landscape. Weir's film makes this clear with its image of Appleyard College as a verdant green block of European manor house and grounds standing out in the redness of Australian soil. The television adaptation similarly surrounds the manicured green grounds of the college with the unfamiliar vegetation of the bush. Yet this intrusion of Europeanness is classed and linked to money. The town near to the college does not have a display of verdant gardens, but is instead more of a collection of buildings in the red earth, drawing together against the wild like a town in a western. Differentiations are made by characters between city dwellers and locals, although local, of course, refers to rural settlers rather than to Indigenous people. Where the English Mike explains time where he is lost at the rock as him getting turned around because there are no landmarks in the bush, Albert will later insist that there are plenty of landmarks if you know where to look for them. The local and the working class is closer to the place than the displaced aristocrat, though still not as close as an Indigenous person. So this is a narrative of people out of place and possibly out of time as well. The undesirables, the misfits, are pushed further and further away from the supposed center of civilization, but they still cannot escape its expectations and structures. Times may be changing, as Sergeant Bumfer tells Mike, with a new scientific world meaning that criminals can be caught regardless of class, while the staff at the college talk excitedly of federation and the colonies of Australia combining to form a nation. But the existing power structures still have control. As Colonel Fitzhubert toasts the new century at his annual soiree, he toasts the continuation of the reign of Queen Victoria into a new century, a continuation of the past rather than the future embracing change. One possible hope for escape could have been to another culture, that of the Aboriginal people, but they are largely absent from the series. As Steele notes, there is actually only one reference to an Aboriginal individual in the novel, an unnamed tracker who is brought from Gippsland in the manner of ordering livestock, and after his lack of success, replaced by a bloodhound. The Aboriginal status is demoted not to that of wildlife, but to that of a domesticated animal of limited use. In the television adaptation, Joe, the tracker, who we can see in the picture there, wears the uniform jacket of the police, though with no insignia, and speaks English, and is clearly valued and trusted by Sergeant Bumfer, who we see in the background, even as he is treated as other by many of the settlers. Marion is sent away at least partly to ensure her assimilation through the finishing offered by the college. There is talk of Indigenous belief and practices, but this is largely second-hand talk of initiations and avoidance of the rock. Joe does corroborate one of those pieces of talk amongst whites when he states that ghosts can jump you, then you carry that ghost. But he doesn't explain any more. So we are mostly left with stories told by white settlers to white settlers, who are working from assumptions and romantic ideas, just as the ritual we see that Mike taking part in at Cambridge, just as Miss McCraw, when she and her sister made a vow to the Van Druy female druids when they visited Stonehenge. The past is imagined, ritual is imagined, and that is projected onto a living but displaced and depleted real population and their culture, which is being intentionally overwritten. Steele also describes how early Australian literature tended to treat the Aboriginal population as monstrous, but that by the late 1890s, however, Aborigines all but disappeared from the literature, and the landscape in the preceding period became increasingly described as containing a darker spiritual aura, a resonant pathetic fallacy that impressed upon Europeans an idea of solitude and desolation. Steele goes on to argue that Lindsay's original novel provokes a reflection on the understanding of Australia as an unpeopled land where nothing of consequence occurred until the British gave it a history. This rejection of the thousands of years of history before colonization could be argued to be the same in the television adaptation, except that Joe and Marion appear as concrete reminders of the attempts at assimilation and erasure, where that is indicated more obliquely in the novel simply by absence. And of course, an absence is something that could be more easily overlooked. So in that way, the connection to the Indigenous people could be taken as part of the process of adaptation of the novel in expanding upon one of the potential readings that Steele identifies. Steele argues that in the novel, Miranda can be understood as an unconscious attempt to create an ancestor spirit for future native-born Europeans in Australia. Because she's born, Miranda's from a settler family, but born in Australia. Irma, meanwhile, as a first-generation European settler, is rejected by the rock, rejected by the land, even though she has a good reason to desire the escape that it offers. But Steele's interpretation fails to explain what the role is of Miss McCraw or Marion here, as they also disappear and, unlike Irma, do not return. The series, though, offers possible explanations. Marion's part Aboriginal heritage connects her ancestrally to the land, also her deep attachment to Miranda. Miss McCraw has her vow that connects her to the ancient past. And Miranda is clearly indicated as a child of nature, more in touch with the natural environment than the other settlers, and also more, you might say, earthy than the Miranda of the Weir film, who is, of course, golden-haired, pale-skinned, whereas Miranda here has darker hair and her skin is tanned from all of the time that she spends outside. Steele argues that the novel is concerned with the timelessness of the landscape, challenging the linear, regimented time of the settlers, overwhelming them with its age, which diminishes the extent of proud European history to insignificance. The disappearances are preceded by a sense of time at the rock standing still as all watches stop. They're followed by time in the novel becoming more fluid, with once carefully wound clocks stopping at the college, and the sense of passing time in the novel becoming less clear. Similarly, the first episode of the series progresses in a fairly straightforward linear progression, beginning with an on-screen title card that states, on St. Valentine's Day 1900, 4 young women vanished from a picnic at Hanging Rock, anchoring the narrative in a specific space and time, though note that this is a European settler space and time. 1900 and St. Valentine's Day not being Aboriginal ways of telling the time, Hanging Rock not being the Aboriginal name for the place. So this is already an imposition of time and space onto what is there. This is followed, however, by a second title card, which reads, "The infamous events began when a mysterious widow purchased a mansion out in the Australian bush." And we're taken back to Appleyard's first viewing of the mansion. So we get more of an emphasis here on backstory, cause, potentially. The episodes proceeds in a linear version from there, the viewing, until the picnic itself, where watches do not just stop, but their hands quiver at midday, so that it's like, it's not that time has stood still, but you are between moments. As the girls start to climb the rock, time slips more obviously, with Miranda glimpsing the 4 girls, including herself, ahead of her on the path up to the rock. Then, in a continuous shot, the camera pans around to show the other girls walking past her, as all looking as if they're in a trance. Meanwhile, back at the college, and we don't know if this is at exactly the same moment or a different time, Mrs. Appleyard dreams of the picnic, of the girls fading away, and then of being herself exposed, and of her dead husband appearing to her. So time has been knocked out of joint. The unraveling continues in later episodes. Episode 2 contains not just moments of temporal dislocation, but clearer signifiers and breaks with a forward linear progression of time in the form of captions, which place the audience at specific times. 2 days missing, 3 days missing, 4 days missing, 1 year earlier, the Fitzhuberts' annual soiree, 21st February 1900. So you get a linear progression of times, but times that date from the disappearance. So the disappearance becomes a starting point. The 1 year earlier caption seems to indicate a clear interruption to a forward progression that is then returned to. But there are actually multiple disruptions. I will mention, of course, the Fitzhuberts' annual soiree is, by saying it's annual, is pointing out this is a recurring event. This is just one instance in a series of recurring events. But when Mrs. Appleyard gives directions to the college servants not to allow anyone onto the grounds as the press are gathering, servants leave, and then as she leaves the wash yard alone, she pauses as we see the missing appear behind her. So we're not seeing her viewpoint. They're apparently suspended in the air. Toes don't touch the ground, their hair streaming upwards. In the 1 year earlier section, Miss McCraw introduces the girls to Mount Diogenes, Hanging Rock, and talks of it being older than the Druids, linking it to her visit to Stonehenge. So what we have here, we might consider as a series with the main narrative which moves forward from St. Valentine's Day 1900 and which is in our past. Beneath that layer of our past, St. Valentine's Day 1900, We layer the flashback to 1 year earlier in the art class. Within the art class, the girls and the audience hear the personal history of Miss McCraw from a number of years earlier, another layer, her visit to Europe. That personal history contains her invocation of the Druids, another layer. And then also her explanation of the far more ancient history of the rock, another layer. So we're exposed to a vertiginous sense of history, a winding back through time, yet all of the times are also present as we view this narrative, and time is collapsed into a present moment. Then back to the main timeline. And we have the college teachers looking forward to the Federation of Australia, while the guests at the Fitzhuberts look forward to a new Victorian century that continues the past. So we have a classed sense of future. The future of the wealthy and aristocratic is one of conservatism and continuation. The future of the middle class and others, presumably, is a federation and a changed future. When Appleyard passes the press gathered at the gates of the college on her way to that soiree, one comments, "There goes tomorrow's headlines, looking forward from their present and into our past." Edith will tell the doctor and Appleyard and Mademoiselle her account of what she saw on the rock, which is illustrated on screen, so that we can connect her description of a red cloud with an experience Albert has on the rock of the sky turning red. So we have to make these connections backwards and forwards ourselves as well. Excuse me. Edith has already regaled a group of girls with her story of what happened, which is tied up with her fear that she may be pregnant simply because she has had her first period, and Appleyard told her to explain what is happening, that she could now get pregnant. So again, past, present, and potential future are all tied up in a moment. Appleyard and Mike both have flashbacks to their own pasts. Her involvement in a murder and robbery, his to the event which probably had him expelled from Cambridge. Mike is alone on the rock when he has his flashback because he is up there searching for the missing after the official search has been called off. He had previously commented to Albert that in England he was christened under the family coat of arms. His whole life planned out ahead of him under the weight of history, but here in Australia at the rock is timeless. This is part of what makes this, for me, a Gothic historical drama, the importance of time and consequence, but also how time is complicated by its presentation. In part, this is a narrative technique to provide suspense and also to make it easier to follow connections by providing backstory at the appropriate moment, though also making it harder to summarize effectively here. But it is also in this example clearly being used in a way which picks up on the novel's use of time. This is supported by the use of modern editing and visual style rather than keeping to a more classical visual and editing and narrative style for the adaptation. The series also makes use of electronic music and sounds on its soundtrack, particularly in creating rhythmic noises, with the rhythm giving a sense of time passing at a steady rate, while the electronic sounds break the period setting to connect to the present. The television adaptation of Picnic at Hanging Rock can, like Taboo, be interpreted in part as a national history told through a personal story. The series focuses much more on Appleyard than Weir's film or the novel, giving her her own secrets and trauma to escape from, which she seeks to do through transforming herself into the widow Appleyard, wealthy middle class rather than working class London criminal, and an educator of young women. This is part of the series' theme of transformation, which picks up on ideas about transformation in the novel, including from the excised concluding chapter, which suggested that the missing women had been physically transformed by the rock. In this series, some of the transformations are desired, but most are resisted because they are transformations away from individuals' true selves and into forms that are desired by dominant society. The series thus shows the traumas of having to conceal and to conform that are driven by racism, sexism, and classism. Traumas and pressures that are still understandable today to many audiences. However, they also, like the history shown in Taboo or Peaky Blinders, have a particular national resonance. Where night series show a country shaped by the power of commerce, Picnic at Hanging Rock shows a country shaped by conservatism and prejudice. As with these other Gothic historical dramas, the audience is encouraged to recognize how these elements of horror and trauma from the past have shaped the modern world, and indeed are still active in the modern world. Through its more explicit connection to landscape and the emphasis that it places on settler culture as a colonizing force imposing itself onto an existing landscape that was already inhabited, Picnic at Hanging Rock even more clearly makes these connections to ideas of the nation as a construction, and one that is relatively recent. But Picnic at Hanging Rock, through characters like Miranda and Marion and Sarah, offers up alternative ways of being that could have been followed. The fact that these alternative ways of being cannot find a place in the world as depicted is part of the enclosure that is part of the Gothic, and that is shown in the series by the closing of all the doors and windows and shutters of the college after the disappearances. While Appleyard says that this is to stop people, such as journalists, getting in, it can also signify the closing off of opportunities, the entrapping of the girls in a darkness created by a worldview that demands conformity, keeping them from the potentialities outside. Time, I think, for another break so that I can have a breath and a bit of water. And if you've got any other questions or any points to discuss, please say, and then I'll round up with a very brief summary conclusion. Right, so just really a quick summarizing of some key ideas here, although some very interesting ones have also been brought out in the discussion. I might have to ask Sam if she's got any notes after this to go with my own ones. We've examined here then some ideas about what I am terming Gothic TV historical dramas or historical Gothic TV variations. So what are these? These are historical dramas on television that engage with Gothic themes of trauma and transgression, and particularly with the horrors of the past, which can be seen as still having relevance to the present. They also make use of Gothic aesthetics, such as a dark colour palette, deep shadows, and plenty of detail and grime. These are lived-in places, clothes, and people rather than a glossily perfect and new recreation, that heritage view. They typically have elements of the mystical or supernatural, although that may just be in imagery and dialogue, rather than the supernatural being present and active within the world of the production. They often mix time periods, such as employing contemporary electric or electronic instrumentation in the music. And again, that could be part of that signaling how these are stories which are still relevant and active in the present. All of this works to differentiate them from other modes of the historical drama, particularly the heritage drama. This is part of the wider scheme to appeal to as many different audiences and taste constructions as possible, and is enabled by changes in production and reception technology. But it doesn't just help to differentiate products, but it engages with a more modern and complex understanding of history. In particular, it is part of an acknowledgement of past wrongs and traumas, particularly those enacted in the name of colonialism and capitalism and nation. Indeed, this is another area where Gothic historical dramas challenge Higson's conception of the heritage drama. This was something that could easily be taken as supporting particular conservative ideas of the nation and national identity. Again, regardless of what happened in the plot and the characters, people are essentially left with, didn't it look nice? Gothic historical dramas, on the other hand, tend to question and destabilize these notions of national identity as natural, as harmless, as somehow standing apart from the rest of the world. Instead, many of them challenge the idea of the national heritage as something to be proud of. Taboo shows Britishness as being based on the work of the dispossessed to exploit people and resources around the world through brutality, whether the brutality of law and administration and commerce or physical brutality. Picnic at Hanging Rock shows the need to escape from expectations and constrictions relating to race, class, gender, sexuality, and shows how this is connected to ideas of land, of belonging. Both programs show a British Empire that is corrupt at its core because of these obsessions with money and power and the identity of those who are deemed appropriate to have money and power. By necessity, these Gothic historic dramas cannot present total victory for the protagonist. It may seem by the end of Taboo's first season that Delaney has won his freedom from the Crown and the company and is setting out to make his own destiny, but he is still operating in a world that is governed by capitalism and trade as a trader and within the political frameworks of the growing United States and its conflict with Britain. The only escape for characters in Picnic at Hanging Rock is to completely disappear from the world. Tommy Shelby in Peaky Blinders has always been manipulated by the system, and the system prevails. Knight's version of Scrooge is not redeemed, but has realized the need to work constantly towards redemption, which is one of my favorite parts of his adaptation of A Christmas Carol, by the way. History also must prevail, even as it is warped and twisted for narrative purposes. Tommy Shelby cannot successfully assassinate Oswald Mosley, much as we may wish that to happen. And Peaky Blinders ends with a clear demonstration of how the far right persists in British politics. Of course, characters can achieve individual